So Washington is elected unanimously to be the first president of the United States. And our guiding question, what challenges did he face during his first term? Just from a simple overarching standpoint, it's important to keep in mind why being first is so significant. A lot of what we do is based off of what people before us have done. We look to someone who's done something and gone, well, I guess I'll do that. They did it. And so Washington is walking this line of, well, I literally fought against a strong federal government, but now I'm a king, but now I'm in a position where I kind of can look like a king. And Washington has to make the presidency not look like a king. Now, this might be weird for us to hear because we keep putting more and more power, belief, expectation, responsibility onto the president and what we think the president should do. I mean, we get mad at the president for gas prices, and that's not a thing the president controls. That's how we view it. But back then, that's not how he wanted it to be viewed. And so he's going to work really hard to establish what are called precedents, so things he does for the first time, that other presidents will follow. The first thing he needs to do is, what type of advisors would George Washington need to run the country effectively? So he's going to create a cabinet. And our cabinet then is a little bit different than our cabinet today. Our cabinet then was Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. Or the State, what is now the Defense, Justice, and Treasury departments. We now have a lot of departments. Watch this. All right, so this is how I remembered this in high school. SDTJICLHHTEVH. Do you know what that is? So it stands for State, Defense, Treasury, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Technology, Energy, Education, Veteran Affairs, and Homeland Security. Those are our departments. Fun fact, it's also the correct succession of the president. President, Vice President, ... It's important to keep in mind John Adams, who was the vice president, not a part of the cabinet. He is not involved in these conversations. So, look, I'll be totally honest. Being the vice president is terrible. It's worthless. There have been notable comments about the vice presidency. Like one person said, I don't want to be vice president because I don't want to get buried until after I'm dead. Some people have been a little bit more vulgar in what they've said. It's well worth a Google, but I can't say them here. Now, we don't really care about the Secretary of War and the Attorney General for our moments here. We particularly care about those two people, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because they're going to play some foundational work in the creation of our first two political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So Thomas Jefferson is an elite, more of an established elite. As you can see, he was born in Virginia, a very significant and populous state and colony. He inherits 5,000 acres of land at Monticello when he's 21. He will help design and create Monticello. In fact, I think I have Monticello. Here you go. It's Monticello. His is much larger, but there you go. Alexander Hamilton is not that person. This is where I want you to pause the video because for legal purposes, I can't put in the Hamilton song, but literally all of Hamilton, if you have Disney Plus, watch it. Well worth it. But that'll lay out a little bit of background on Alexander Hamilton, who really comes from very little, works his way up, and ends up joining the elite status. And again, think about what I talked about last time from Alexander Hamilton. It's a little ironic to think that this person who had nothing and then rose to power would have such a contentious and kind of ugly view of regular everyday people, but he does. Hamilton is the Secretary of the Treasury, and what he needs to do is come up with an economic plan for America. And so Hamilton's financial plan has three parts. The first is the federal government is going to assume states' debts. And essentially the way this works is each state during the American Revolution had borrowed money to put up for their funding of the war. And then each state had made attempts to pay that back. In general, you're going to see the South had paid that back. They're swimming in a lot more money. And the North had not paid that back yet. And Hamilton goes, you know what? We need the federal government to have the ability to acquire credit. And what you need in order to get a credit score is you need to have borrowed money and made attempts to pay it back. Creditors, or people who are lending you money, want to know that you will pay them back. And so what he says is, let's take all this debt from the states, put it into one pile, give it to the federal government, and then the states will work together to pay off that debt. And this will help the federal government look good in the eyes of other countries and for other creditors. That's really good if you're thinking in terms of the federal government. That's really good if you're the North because, hey, you probably aren't going to have to pay as much for your debt than before. But if you're the South, you don't like this. I already paid back my debts. I don't want to do this. And so there is going to be some contention here. The second part has two parts. One, a tax on whiskey. We need to make money, so let's have a tax. I do want you to keep in mind, though, federal government's giving taxes. Where have we heard that before? That's what they fought against in the American Revolution. Now, there is some representation, and so that's how they can get away with this, but we'll hold on to this. People aren't super happy about this tax. The other part of this is a protective tariff. A tariff is a tax on imported goods, and it's a way for a federal government or a national government to control and protect their own industry and manufacturing. Basically, the way it works is if we're talking about bolts of cloth, let's say I have a bolt of cloth from England and it's exactly the same as the one from America, and they're both priced at $4, well, there's no incentive to buy either one. Now, what the federal government wants to do is they want you to buy from American companies because that helps America. So what they need to do is incentivize you to pick the American one. And the best way to incentivize you is price. But we can't just cut the price of American goods because that doesn't actually help you make more money. What can we do? I know. Let's raise the price of the British good. That's through a tariff, a tax on imported goods. Now, Britain is going to pay that tax initially, but then raise their price in order to make that money back. So now let's say you go in the store and the American bolt of cloth is $4, but the British bolt of cloth is $6. Well, now more people are going to buy American because the cloth's the same, it's fine, all right, we're going to buy American. Now, more people are buying, so you have an increased volume, which is great. That's going to lead for more money for manufacturers. Technically, no one's really lost here except the British. But what those companies can do is they can now raise their price from $4 to $5. Now, they're still the cheapest game in town. They now have still the volume, but they're also going to be making a larger profit on each one of those. If you're in that industry, that's awesome. America as a whole, sure, that's getting more money for America, it's great. But if you're a regular everyday person, especially people in the South, you don't like this for two reasons. One, well, your cheapest option before was $4. Now your cheapest option is $5, so I have to pay more money? And also, if Great Britain is losing money in America, well, what are they going to do to the goods that America wants to sell to them, which frequently are coming from the South? So the South is worried about other countries taking some retribution out on their products and then making less money. And finally, the third one, a Bank of the United States, or as we'll call it, a BUS. There's a whole bunch of macroeconomic arguments to be made about this. We're not going to wade into all of those. We're just going to suffice it to say, basically, a Bank of the United States can control economic policy. And the way that works, and again, we're really glossing over some macroeconomics, is if the federal government wants more people to be borrowing money, then they can loan more money out to state banks. Those state banks can then loan those out to other people. If they want people to not be borrowing as much money, they can withdraw the amount that they're loaning to state banks, who will then withdraw that amount from the people that they're loaning to. Again, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's macroeconomics. The compromise that is reached, and quite literally, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson go in a room, sit down, and make this agreement. So again, this isn't like the people are choosing. This isn't even like Congress is choosing. Both of these men decide, and then they tell their sides what to do. So they agreed to pass the financial plan, however, not the protective tariff. We aren't going to have that tariff. If the capital will be moved from where it was in New York, it was a tentative capital, to Washington, D.C., which is in the South. And so basically Jefferson gave up economic policy in return to get the capital to be in the South. And look, if we want to look at this from a long-term perspective, that's a better win for Hamilton. That economic plan had a way bigger impact over America than the location of Washington, D.C. So you're going to be diving into the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and I'll give you a little bit of a blurb about each to get you started. And then what I'm going to have you do is look through some quotes and see who would say this, Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson. What I want you to do first, though, is kind of do that chart before you answer these questions. So the Federalists believe in a strong federal government. They believe in manufacturers. They believe in bankers, the elites. They believe in, well, typically northern people. They like those tariffs. They don't really care about regular everyday people. Democratic Republicans are like the opposite. Democratic Republicans want state governments to be most powerful because they're closer to the people. They want individuals to be self-sufficient. We like small-scale farmers. We don't like those bankers. We don't like those rich traders. And now, technically, planters are also going to align themselves more with the Democratic Republicans because they stand to lose more by cooperating with a federal government taxation policy. There's also the idea of how are we going to interpret the Constitution. The Federalists would want a loose interpretation. Let's stretch that, give more powers to Congress. They can do anything that's necessary and proper. Whereas the Democratic Republicans are like, no, strict interpretation, we are not going to give them any extra powers. You see that play out when it comes to judges. I mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg the other day. That's what we're talking about when it comes to liberal or conservative justices. Conservative justices are like, no, we're going to stick to the document that's in front of us. And liberal judges are typically more willing to extend some of that power and overreach of the federal government. All right, take a second, read this. Who do you think would say it? This is Alexander Hamilton. If you look in the middle there, he says there are two groups of people, the rich and well-born, and then the mass of the people. And you should give the first class a distinct and permanent share in the government. People really wouldn't agree with that today. The tremendous irony here, though, is that Hamilton is championed as like this leader of democracy, and yet he's doing a lot of stuff that the right would do at this point now, and the right is not being heralded as champions of democracy because, yeah, it's not democratic to be like, man, I don't think all the people should vote. All right, what about this one? Yeah, that's Jefferson. We can't be managed by a single government. That one's pretty straightforward. What about this one? Make sure you read it. So it's easy to look at this and be like, oh, workers, that's great, Hamilton. But it's not. This is Jefferson saying, hey, that manufacturing, keep it in Europe. We don't need it here. Small self-sufficient farmers. We don't want to get all that complicated economic stuff. We don't want to worry about it. What about this? The key to this one is that loose interpretation versus strict interpretation. Literally, he's like, I read it as this. That means it is exactly this. So this would be Jefferson. What about this? Yeah, this one, obviously, Hamilton. He wants a Bank of the United States. And then one of the other main things that happens in the first term for Washington is the Judiciary Act of 1789. Long story short, the Constitution was very vague in how the court system was going to be set up, and so this solidifies that process. So there's a three-tier system, as you can see here: district courts, Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. District court would hear it for the first time at the federal level, the appeals court would be your appeals process, and then the final say-so will be the Supreme Court. When the Judiciary Act is passed, it does set up with 6 Supreme Court justices, which is then later changed to 9. But that is significant in our moment in history. The Congress will, and President, by vetoing or not, will decide how many justices there should be in the Supreme Court.